The fountain ran clean and steady, while everything else at the Hargrove estate performed grief. Daniel Lopez stood near the white stone basin at the edge of the reception lawn, far enough from the main crowd to breathe without inhaling someone else's performance, close enough that no one could reasonably accuse him of abandonment. The champagne in his hand had gone warm 40 minutes ago. He hadn't touched it since. Around him, black suits clustered on the manicured grass in the formation that money teaches, backs straight, voices low, faces arranged into expressions that communicated sorrow without conceding vulnerability. Three women near the rose arbor took turns touching each other's arms. Two men in identical gray ties discussed something that made one of them check his phone. Daniel watched all of it the way he watched a waiting room cataloging, assessing, moving on. 6 months. That was the full weight of what he was doing here, standing at the edge of a funeral reception for a man he had never met, holding warm champagne for a woman he had spent 6 months learning. Sandra Anderson, age 38, CEO of Lawson Event Partners, currently standing 40 feet away in a black dress that fit like something chosen before the world went sideways. Her dark hair pulled back severe, her posture the kind that took years to build and grief couldn't fully touch. She was in the middle of a circle of relatives and family friends who kept touching her elbow, and she kept accepting it, and every 30 seconds or so, her smile would reassemble itself from whatever it had collapsed into between interactions. Daniel had pronounced enough deaths in his career to understand what funerals actually were. They weren't for the deceased. They were architecture structures the living built to convince themselves that grief had a shape, a timeline, a reception afterward with canapes. He respected the necessity. He had no use for the performance. His pager sat heavy in his jacket pocket. Three things waiting at County General. A post-surgical patient whose numbers had been trending in the wrong direction since morning. A staffing gap in the overnight trauma bay that his deputy had flagged twice. A supply authorization for the East Wing that maintenance needed before the weekend. All of it would keep. He had made sure before he came that everything that could be handled had been handled. And everything that couldn't had been assigned to someone qualified to watch it. Daniel Lopez did not leave loose ends when he left the building. He had learned that from the first death he presided over as a resident, the one where he had stepped away for 11 minutes and come back to a family standing in the hallway with nowhere to put their faces. He had not stepped away imprecisely since. The afternoon light shifted through the estate's oak canopy, dropped long shadows across the stone path between him and Sandra. He watched the exact moment her current smile failed, watched her eyes go flat and distant while her mouth held the shape. The woman beside her was still talking. Daniel set the champagne glass on the stone edge of the fountain basin and started across the lawn. The crowd near Sandra shifted without being asked. He stepped into her space, positioned himself at her left shoulder, close enough to be clearly present, far enough to give her room. The woman who had been talking trailed off, looked between them, made the social calculation, and found somewhere else to be. The rest of the circle dissolved in the quiet way that groups do when they sense the gravity in a room has changed. "Excuse us." Not a question. He turned Sandra toward the house with one hand at her elbow, gentle and certain, and she let him, her body angling into his like she'd been leaning into wind for hours, and someone had finally blocked it. When they reached the side entrance, she spoke first. "Thank you. Your mother asked me to stay tonight." Daniel opened the door, checked the hallway. Empty. "She said not tonight. Don't leave you alone tonight." Sandra stopped walking. "What?" 3 words. Then she left. Sandra absorbed this. Something crossed her face that wasn't surprise, more like recognition of a move she should have anticipated. "She checks everyone's pulse when she shakes their hand. Did she do that to you?" "She didn't shake my hand." Sandra almost smiled. Then she already decided. They were in his car and through the estate gates in 73 seconds. Daniel had timed it on the way in, same as he timed everything, not from compulsion, but from the understanding that time was the only resource that couldn't be restocked. Sandra's apartment was in the Arts District 4th floor of a converted textile warehouse with original brick and windows that ran floor to ceiling on the west wall. She had shown it to him once, apologizing for the chaos of fabric samples and event proposals spread across every surface like a working mind made visible. Tonight the apartment was clean. Someone had been here. Sandra stood in the middle of the living room and didn't quite recognize it. "Sit." He pointed to the couch. "I'm fine." You've been standing in heels for 5 hours. Sit. She sat. He went to the kitchen, found glasses, filled one with water, brought it back. She took it without argument, which told him more than her words had. Drink. You're very bossy for someone who came to a funeral as a plus one. I'm very good at keeping people alive. It requires directness. He sat in the chair across from her, far enough to give her room, close enough to be useful. The city outside the tall windows was making its early evening sounds. A bus, a dog, the low hum of a neighborhood that doesn't stop for private grief. Sandra drank the water, set the glass down with the careful deliberateness of someone keeping themselves together by controlling small things. Your mother was right, Daniel said. You shouldn't be alone tonight. And you're the designated solution. I'm the person who wants to be here. She looked at him, then really looked the way she didn't always let herself. Why? He had the easy answer available. He'd had it ready for the last 3 months, the one about commitment and partnership and what relationships were supposed to mean. He didn't use it. I don't remember the last time I felt anything, he said instead. At the hospital, I make decisions. Good ones mostly. I keep people breathing. I'm good at it. But it stopped feeling like anything a long time ago. I'd go home and I wouldn't feel tired or satisfied or even hungry. I just existed until it was time to go back. Sandra was very still. Then 6 months ago, you told me my hors d'oeuvre selection for the fundraiser was going to actively offend the cardiologists in the room, and you were so precise about it, and I felt annoyed. Actually annoyed, which sounds like nothing, but it was the first real feeling I'd had in over a year. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. So I want to be here, because when I'm with you, I remember I'm something other than a diagnostic function. She cried then. Not loud, not performed, just silent, steady tears she didn't rush to wipe away. He stayed in his chair and gave her the space to feel it, without someone trying to fix it. After a while, she spoke again, her voice steadier than he expected. Dorothy likes you. Your mother. She told me at the reception. Said you had good hands. Sandra wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. She checks everyone's pulse when she first meets them. She says you can learn more about a person in 3 seconds of contact than in an hour of conversation. What does a steady pulse mean to a cardiac nurse? Either very calm or very well trained. The corner of Sandra's mouth moved. She said probably both in your case. Smart woman. She also said I should keep you. Sandra stood, walked to the window. The city lights were beginning orange and white against the darkening sky. My father's going to want to meet you properly, not at a funeral. Okay. He's going to ask invasive questions. I can handle invasive questions. He's going to be rude about the timeline. 6 months, Thomas, gone 6 months, and you're already... She stopped. The sentence didn't have an ending she wanted to say out loud. Already what? He'll think it's too fast. Daniel joined her at the window, stood close enough that the warmth came through without contact. There's no correct speed. There's just what's real. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He felt her through his jacket, the slight tremor, the weight of someone who had been holding themselves upright for a very long time. Stay tonight, she said. Just stay. I don't want to be alone. I'm not going anywhere. They stood at the window until the sky went fully dark and she stopped shaking. He took the couch. She didn't argue. He woke at 4:17 a.m. to his pager. Not the code he'd been half expecting from the post-surgical case. Different extension, night attending. He read the details in the dark and called from Sandra's kitchen with the light off, keeping his voice low enough not to carry down the hall. The attending explained it cleanly. Transplant patient, unexpected rejection markers, standard treatment, contraindicated by an allergy buried 3 layers deep in the file. She wanted to try an alternate immunosuppressant protocol. Clinically sound, but outside standard procedure, which meant it needed director authorization before she could proceed. What's the patient's current status? Daniel said. She gave him vitals. Stable, but the wrong kind of stable, the kind that didn't stay that way. Authorization granted. Document everything and flag me on every vitals update until I'm in. You're not here. Personal matter. Dr. Reynolds has oversight until 7. A beat of silence. Then, understood. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. He hung up, turned around. Sandra was standing in the bedroom doorway in sleep clothes, hair loose, watching him with an expression that wasn't quite awake yet. Sorry, he said. Tried to keep it quiet. Is everything all right? Transplant patient Needed an authorization. They have it handled. She moved into the kitchen without asking whether he wanted coffee and started the machine from muscle memory, the automatic gesture of someone who had lived with another person for a long time. The observation landed somewhere in his chest and he let it. She handed him a mug. Steam rose between them. You gave them permission to go outside the protocol, she said. The protocol didn't fit the patient. Do you do that a lot? 74 times in the last 6 months. Sandra held her mug in both hands. Thomas used to say you can read a person completely by how they handle being woken up at 4 in the morning. He said most people are slow, confused, need time to gather themselves. She looked at Daniel over the rim of her mug. He said the ones worth trusting just wake up and handle it. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was. She said it simply without the defensive edge that people sometimes used when they weren't sure whether they were allowed to still mean it. He would have liked you, I think. He respected competence, and he had no patience for people who hid behind position. Daniel drank his coffee. You don't know that. I know exactly that. She almost smiled again. It's slightly terrifying, actually, how certain I am. His pager went off again. Same code, different floor. Go, Sandra said. I'm fine. Dorothy's coming at 8 anyway. You sure, Daniel? Her voice was steady and kind and completely certain. Go. He left before he could find a reason to stay longer. The drive to County General took 11 minutes at that hour. He handled both flags before 6 reviewed the transplant patient's updated chart, improving, which was the right direction, and had the staffing gap resolved before his deputy arrived. By 7:15, he was at his desk with a third coffee and an inbox that had grown overnight like something alive. The email arrived at 8:43 a.m. on Monday. Subject line Director Performance Review required attendance. Thursday, 2 p.m. Board Conference Room A. His name in the field. Patricia Johnson's signature at the bottom formatted with her full title, Chief of the Board of Directors, County General Hospital. Daniel read it twice, then forwarded it to Angela without comment. She called in 6 minutes, which was faster than he expected, and exactly as fast as she was capable of when she sensed something significant. What did you do? She said without greeting. Good morning. Don't. Performance review. You've been director for 2 years and you have never had a performance review. What is happening? He pulled up his schedule and started blocking time. Johnson has been tracking my authorization patterns. 74 protocol deviations in 6 months. You told me about those. Every single one was clinically sound and documented. Correct. So it's not actually about the authorizations. He paused just long enough that Angela, who had spent 35 years learning to read the silences of a man who didn't waste words, understood the answer before he gave it. Sandra, she said. Johnson mentioned it at the last director's meeting. Said a director in a relationship with a high-profile event CEO created conflicts of interest. Said it reflected on my professional judgment. 3 seconds of silence. Then Angela said very quietly, I need you to repeat that back to me because I want to make sure I understood correctly. You understood correctly? She said your personal relationship reflects on your professional judgment. That's the substance of it. Daniel. Her voice had gone to the register she used when she was choosing between several responses and selecting the most controlled one. That is not a performance review. That is a personal attack dressed in institutional language. And it is almost certainly discriminatory on multiple grounds, and I need you to let me. Angela. I am a family law attorney, not a civil rights. Angela. He said it with the same tone he used to stop a room when someone was about to make a decision that couldn't be walked back. I'm going to show up Thursday and answer their questions. The outcome's data speaks for itself. Data doesn't speak. People speak. Data just sits there while people decide whether to listen to it. Then I'll make sure they listen. She was quiet for a moment. Her chair creaked through the phone, the old leather one she'd had since law school, the one she refused to replace because it had survived everything. How's Sandra handling all of this? She doesn't know about the review. Daniel. She just buried her husband's memory. She doesn't need to carry this too. You can't protect her from everything. I can protect her from this one. Angela sighed the long exhale of someone who had been having variations of this conversation with the same person for 30 years. Fine. But when this gets worse before it gets better, and it will, don't say I didn't warn you. They hung up. He went back to work. 3 cases needed chart reviews. A surgery schedule conflict needed a decision. The East Wing HVAC had escalated from a flagged issue to a maintenance emergency, and the team was waiting on his authorization to order emergency parts. He handled all of it before lunch. At 1:30 p.m., Sandra texted venue walkthrough near the hospital tomorrow. Lunch after, he typed back noon. I'll meet you in the lobby. She sent back a small image, a drawing. Stick figures, 3 of them labeled in a child's handwriting, Daddy, Sandra. Me. He stared at it for longer than was strictly explainable. Then he put the phone face down and went back to work. Lily had drawn it that morning before school. Sandra had sent it without explanation, which meant she understood that no explanation was needed. Daniel's daughter was 6 years old and had been drawing people in groups of 3 since her mother died. For 2 years, the drawings had been Daniel, Lily, and a figure labeled Mom, sometimes rendered with wings, sometimes without, always present. Then 8 weeks ago, after the hospital fundraiser where Lily had decided without any adult input that Sandra Anderson was worth investigating, the third figure had started changing. First Lady, then Sandra Lady, and now apparently just Sandra. Daniel Lopez had survived medical school residency, 3 years of raising a child alone, and the grief of watching his wife diminish over 14 months of treatment. He had not expected to be undone by a crayon drawing. He was not undone. He was close. Lily had been born with a ventricular septal defect, a small structural gap in her heart, the kind that pediatric cardiologists called minor and parents called terrifying, for approximately 2 years before they learned to recalibrate. The defect had closed partially on its own by the time she was 4, leaving a residual irregularity that her cardiologist monitored annually and described each time as clinically unremarkable. Daniel monitored it differently. Not from panic, he had too much clinical knowledge for panic, but from the attentiveness of a man who understood exactly what could go wrong in a human heart and had reasons he could not afford to learn that lesson personally. He put his hand on her chest at bedtime. Not every night. Most nights. He had done it out of habit the first time Sandra stayed over, when Lily had fallen asleep on Sandra's couch, and he'd gone to check on her without thinking about the audience. Sandra had asked why. He had told her the truth, and Sandra had turned away before he could see her face, which he had understood meant something, though he hadn't yet known exactly what. The venue was a restored theater, downtown marble floors, gold leaf ceiling, details, acoustics designed for a different century's idea of grandeur. Sandra moved through it with a clipboard and a laser measure, talking to the venue manager about load-bearing capacities and power access for audio equipment. Daniel followed 3 steps behind, carrying her bag, which was heavier than it looked, and contained, among other things, 2 different colored pens, a roll of measuring tape, a protein bar she had not eaten, and a folder of vendor contracts organized by event date. He had offered to carry it when they met in the hospital lobby. She had handed it over without breaking stride. The venue manager, a nervous man in his early 50s, with the anxiety of someone accountable for irreplaceable architecture, kept glancing at Daniel in a way that suggested he was trying to determine his function. "What do you think?" Sandra turned to Daniel without warning. 180 seated for dinner. Is that feasible in this space? Daniel scanned the room. Square footage, column, placement, emergency exit positioning, table dimension standards. 180 is your maximum. 200 would put you over the fire code occupancy for a seated configuration. The manager blinked. How did you? He runs a hospital, Sandra said, already writing. He knows occupancy codes at a level most people consider unusual. She looked up at Daniel with something in her expression that was part amusement and part something quieter. 180 it is. They finished the walkthrough in 38 minutes. Sandra confirmed the booking, thanked the manager with the warmth of someone who knew that venue relationships were long-term investments, and they walked out into November afternoon sun. Lunch, she said. 2 blocks west. Good sandwiches. They walked. She was quiet but the comfortable kind, the silence of someone who wasn't filling space because they didn't need to. My father wants to have dinner, she said finally. This weekend. He wants to meet you properly. Okay. He was a colonel, 30 years. He has a way of evaluating people, and he's not subtle about it. I've delivered difficult news to family members who were looking for someone to be angry at. I can handle a structured evaluation. She stopped walking and turned to face him on the sidewalk. Why do you do that? Do what? Make everything sound manageable. Like there's no situation you haven't already categorized and prepared for, because there usually isn't. That's not actually comforting Daniel. That's a different kind of alone. He held that. She wasn't wrong. The competence that had carried him through medical school and residency and 2 years of single fatherhood and his wife's death had a shadow side that he didn't examine often because examination wasn't the same as action, and action was what kept people breathing. But Sandra was looking at him with the directness of someone who wasn't going to accept a clinical answer, so he gave her the real one. My wife died on a Tuesday morning. I was at the hospital. I got the call at 6:52 a.m., and I finished the shift I was in the middle of because there was a patient in Bay 4 who needed me more than the situation in my personal life needed me to stand in a parking lot and feel it. He started walking again, and she matched his pace. I'm not saying that was right. I'm saying that's how I learned to function. And it worked until it didn't. And by the time I figured out it wasn't working anymore, I'd already been doing it for 2 years. Sandra was quiet for a block. Dorothy, she said. She came over the night Thomas died. She didn't say anything for the first 3 hours. She just stayed in the kitchen and kept making tea that I didn't drink. Around midnight, she said, "The point isn't the tea." What was the point in presence? She said grief needs an audience or it turns inward and damages the infrastructure. Sandra looked at him sideways. She was a cardiac nurse for 35 years. Everything is infrastructure. She's not wrong. She's usually not. Sandra stopped in front of a restaurant with a hand-lettered sign and a line that suggested it was worth waiting for. She told me yours was steady. She said steady under those conditions means either training or character. Usually both. And she said I should keep you. Sandra said it plainly without apology or performance, the way she said things when she had already decided they were true. She also said she'd never told me that about anyone before. In case that matters. They got sandwiches, found a bench outside in the thin afternoon light. Sandra talked about the literacy nonprofit, the event she'd been building for 3 months, the funding challenges a board member who kept suggesting cuts to the children's programming because the adult programming photographed better. She came alive talking about it. The grief was still present. He could see it in the pauses. The places where her train of thought went somewhere private and came back slightly different, but it wasn't the only thing. She was more than it. That was what mattered. His pager went off at 1:47. Sandra didn't flinch. She waited while he checked the message. "Do you need to go? Update from the attending. They have it." He put the pager away. "Tell me about the board member." She did. Dorothy answered the door of Gary Young's house herself, which told Daniel something about the household's internal dynamics before he crossed the threshold. She took the flowers he'd brought, dahlias, which he had researched, and the wine which he had spent longer than he wanted to admit selecting. "Right on time," she said. "Mrs. Dorothy." She handed the flowers back. "Put these in water. Vase is under the left cabinet." And then she was gone, already moving through the house, already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. Daniel found the vase, found the cabinet, put the flowers in water, brought them to the dining room table. All of it felt like a test he hadn't been told he was taking. Gary Young was on the stone patio through the French doors, 68 years old, silver-haired, straight-backed, in the way of someone whose posture had been trained into them, young enough that retirement hadn't loosened it. He had the kind of face that had been handsome and become something better weathered in a way that registered as authority rather than age. Sandra stood beside him. She saw Daniel through the glass, and something in her expression adjusted, not relief exactly, but calibration, like a reading that had been slightly off coming into range. Gary's handshake was a full assessment firm grip held 2 seconds past the point that most men held at eye contact that didn't waver. He had done this 10,000 times and he wasn't disguising it. "Doctor," Gary said, "Dorothy tells me you run the emergency operations at County General." "Director of Emergency Medicine, yes, sir." "Stressful work." "It has its challenges." "And you find time for my daughter between those challenges." Sandra made a small sound. Gary didn't look at her. Daniel raised one hand, a small gesture in Sandra's direction. "I have this," and she went still. "I make time for what matters," Daniel said. "Sandra matters." Gary's eyes narrowed fractionally. He was measuring something. "You're 38 years old." "Yes, sir." "Sandra is 38 years old." "I'm aware." "Thomas has been gone 6 months." "Yes, sir." And you've been in Sandra's life for 6 months. I met Sandra while Thomas was alive. We were not in a relationship then. We began spending time together after his death at Sandra's pace and her choosing. Gary was quiet for 3 seconds. Not a social silence, a deliberate one. The kind that a man of his background used to watch people decide what they were actually made of. If you're asking whether I took advantage of her grief, Daniel said the answer is no. If you're asking whether I care about your daughter and intend to continue caring about her, the answer is yes. If you're asking what happens when my hospital needs me and Sandra needs me at the same time. He met Gary's gaze directly. I'll make the hard call and I'll live with the consequence. But I won't make promises I can't keep to get through this conversation. I won't lie to Sandra, and I won't disappear when things get complicated. Gary studied him for 5 seconds, not hostile, weighing. Then, dinner's ready. Let's go in. Dorothy caught Daniel's eye as he passed her in the doorway. Just for a moment. She was not smiling exactly, but there was something in her face that was close enough. The dinner itself was not warm. It was civil, which was its own kind of progress. Gary asked questions about the hospital, about residency, about how Daniel had chosen emergency medicine, the kind of questions that were actually asking whether a person understood the cost of what they'd committed to. Daniel answered them the way he answered hard questions at the hospital, directly, without editorializing, with the confidence of someone who had already made peace with the demands of what he'd chosen. Sandra was quiet through most of it, watching. The same way she watched events, she was coordinating, not passively, but with the alertness of someone reading a room for what it actually needed. When Gary went to get a second bottle of wine, Dorothy leaned across the table to Daniel. He checked your pulse too, she said, when you shook his hand. Daniel looked at her. He doesn't know he does it, Dorothy said. I've watched him do it for 40 years. Old habit, reading a person's physiology under stress. She refilled her own glass. Yours was steady. He won't tell you that. But that's what you need to know. The drive home was quiet in the way that silence is full. Sandra sat in the passenger seat looking at the highway lights. You did well, she said. I told him the truth. That's what I mean. He glanced at her. She was still looking at the road ahead. He's going to make this difficult, she said, not in a hostile way, in a testing way. He does it to everyone he thinks might actually matter. Then he can keep testing. Daniel, she turned to look at him. You don't have to prove yourself to my family. I know that. He kept his eyes on the road. But your father spent 30 years making hard calls about who to trust in the situations where trusting the wrong person had real consequences. I understand that kind of caution. I'd rather earn it than dismiss it. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. Dorothy called me after you left last time, she said. After you stayed the night of the funeral. She said in 35 years of cardiac nursing, she learned that the heart tells you things that the face is still deciding, and that yours told her something worth paying attention to. Daniel said nothing. There were moments that didn't need a response, and he had learned to recognize them. He pulled up to Sandra's building. She didn't get out immediately. Lily drew another picture today, she said. Before school, she asked me which color I thought was most like her mother. He went still. I didn't know what to say, so I asked her which color she thought. What did she say? Purple. Sandra looked at her hands. She said purple is warm, but it has some blue in it. Sad and warm at the same time. A pause. She said she was going to use it in the next drawing. Daniel looked straight ahead at the building entrance. The lobby light was on. A bicycle was locked to the rack by the door. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the pressure somewhere behind his sternum that had no clinical name. She's 6 years old, he said, and his voice was not quite as steady as he intended it to be. She's extraordinary, Sandra said, and she picked me. I don't take that lightly. She got out of the car, paused at the door, turned back. For the record, she said, I don't take you lightly either. He watched her go inside, sat in the parked car for 2 minutes he couldn't entirely account for afterward. Then he drove home. The email was waiting when he opened his laptop at the kitchen table, still in his jacket, the house quiet and Lily asleep down the hall. He had read it twice already. He read it a third time now, not because the words had changed, but because the third reading was where he stopped hoping they might. Director Performance Review, required attendance, Patricia Johnson. He pulled up the outcomes data file he kept for exactly this kind of conversation. 74 protocol deviations, each documented, each with full outcome records attached. Patient survival rate, complication rates, length of stay comparisons against standard protocol. He had built the file 6 weeks ago when he first sensed the direction the wind was blowing. With the same methodology he used when preparing to make an argument that would be challenged by people who had already decided their conclusion. The data was good. The data was in fact excellent. Angela was right that data didn't speak for itself. But he had learned long ago that the way to win an argument you were going to be dragged into, whether you wanted it or not, was to have already done the work, to show up with more precision than the people expecting you to be rattled. He closed the laptop, walked down the hall to Lily's room and stood in the doorway. She was asleep on her side, one arm thrown over a stuffed rabbit that had been white once and was now the gray of long affection. The nightlight cast her in soft blue. He could see the rise and fall of her breathing from here. He didn't go in, just stood at the threshold the way he had since she was an infant, doing the calculation that parents do in dark doorways. Is this real? Is she well? Is the world still holding together? And finding, as he always did, that the answer was yes. On her desk in the blue light, he could see the drawing. 3 figures, the third one labeled with a name. He had been a doctor long enough to understand that the human heart was a mechanical object with measurable parameters and predictable failure modes. He had also lived long enough to know that this understanding was only true as far as it went, and it did not go very far. He pulled the door halfway and went to bed. His pager went off at 4:17. He was awake before it finished its first cycle. The pancake batter was too thin, and Lily knew it. She stood on her step stool at Daniel's kitchen counter on a Sunday morning, studying the consistency with the focused disapproval of someone who had made this mistake before and was not interested in making it again. Sandra stood beside her, holding the mixing bowl at the angle Lily had specified, watching the child's face with an expression that Daniel could see from the doorway open unguarded. The specific attention of someone who had decided this moment mattered and wasn't going to perform it. "More flour," Lily said. "Not a lot, just enough." "How do I know how much is enough?" "You'll know when it looks right." Sandra reached for the flour container. "What does right look like?" "Like a slow waterfall." Lily demonstrated with her hands a gesture that was entirely her own invention, both specific and completely clear. "Not a fast waterfall, a slow one." Sandra added flour in small increments, stirring between each addition, deferring entirely to the 6-year-old's judgment. She did not talk down to Lily. She did not rush her. She asked genuine questions and waited for genuine answers, and Lily, who had a finely calibrated detector for people who were only pretending to be interested, had registered this within the first 3 minutes and responded by becoming the most precise cooking instructor she knew how to be. Daniel stayed in the doorway. He did not announce himself. He had come to get coffee and found this instead, and something in his chest had made a decision to stay very still rather than disturb it. He had watched Sandra manage 200 guests at a nonprofit gala. He had watched her redirect a venue manager mid-crisis without raising her voice. He had watched her read a room full of grief and perform the necessary grace of it without letting it crush her. He had not watched her stand in his kitchen at 7 a.m. learning to make pancakes from his daughter, and the difference between those things was not small. He got his coffee. Neither of them noticed him leave. The venue walkthrough had been Tuesday, the dinner with Gary on Saturday, and this was Sunday, which meant Sandra had been in and around his life for 6 consecutive days in a way that had happened gradually and then all at once the way most significant things did. She had stayed Friday night after a late event coordination call that ran past 11, and Lily had found her on the couch at 6:30 Saturday morning and apparently conducted a full assessment before deciding the pancake lesson was necessary. Daniel had learned about this sequence of events from Lily at breakfast, delivered with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of a child who saw no reason to editorialize. The week ahead had its own architecture. The performance review was Thursday at 2. Angela had called twice since Monday with the specific frequency of someone who was containing themselves with effort. He had not told Sandra. He was still not telling Sandra a decision he was aware was not strictly defensible, but that he was committed to until he understood the shape of the thing better. What he understood currently was this: Patricia Johnson was not conducting a review of his clinical judgment. She was conducting a review of whether Daniel Lopez was the kind of man who could be managed, and the answer she was hoping for was yes, and every piece of evidence he had accumulated in 2 years of directorship suggested the answer was no, and Thursday would be the formal occasion for that disagreement to become official. He was not afraid of Thursday. He was, however, aware that the ground between now and Thursday required careful walking. Monday came in with a trauma-based situation at 6:15 that required his physical presence before his first coffee was finished, and the morning rebuilt itself around a 34-year-old with a construction accident and a surgical team that needed a director to authorize an off-protocol approach to a bleed that wasn't responding to standard intervention. Daniel authorized it in 40 seconds after reviewing the imaging, stayed through the first hour of surgery, and was back at his desk by 9 with a complication count of 0 and another entry for the outcomes file. 75 deviations now. He documented it the way he documented all of them, precise, complete, with the clinical justification attached and the outcome recorded. He had learned in his first year as director that documentation was not bureaucracy. It was armor. The people who had no record of why they made decisions were the people who couldn't defend them when someone decided the decisions needed defending. Johnson's administrative assistant emailed at 10 to confirm Thursday's meeting. Daniel replied with a single word, confirmed. Then he called Angela. "Tell me what you know about Johnson's pattern," he said. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning. Tell me." Angela's chair creaked. She had been waiting for this call. "She's done this 3 times in 6 years. 2 directors before you, 1 department head. All 3 had deviation rates above the hospital average. All 3 were eventually pressured into either conforming or resigning. Outcomes. For the hospital, mixed. For the individuals, 2 resigned. 1 conformed and lasted another 4 years before burning out. And the patients in their departments during the pressure period, a pause. I don't have that data." "I do." He pulled up the file. Department outcomes dropped an average of 12% in the quarters following director behavioral changes. Correlation isn't causation, but the numbers are suggestive. "Are you going to present that Thursday?" "I'm going to present everything Thursday." "Daniel." Her voice shifted, not softer but more direct, the way she got when she was about to say something she'd been circling. "Johnson called Sandra." He went still. "I don't know when exactly. I found out this morning Sandra called me because she needed to talk to someone who wasn't you, and she picked me because she didn't want you to know yet that she was worried." Angela let this land. Johnson called her personal cell, presented herself as acting out of concern, said a man under investigation shouldn't have to make choices about his career, and that a woman who genuinely cared about him would understand that. Daniel set down his pen. The office was quiet except for the HVAC and the distant rhythm of the hospital moving around him. "She called her personal number," he said. "Yes." "About my employment situation?" "Yes." Using language designed to make Sandra feel that staying with me was harming me. "That's an accurate characterization." He said nothing for a moment. What he felt was not quite anger. Anger was too simple and too hot for what was moving through him. It was something colder and more specific. The recognition that someone had reached past the professional boundary into his personal life and touched something he had not given them access to, with the deliberate intention of moving a person he cared about, like a piece on a board. "Does Sandra know I know?" he asked. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first." "Don't tell her I know. I need to understand what she's decided before I respond." "She hasn't decided anything. She's upset. She's thinking." "Good, that means she's taking it seriously instead of dismissing it." "Daniel, she's thinking about whether Johnson is right." He understood what Angela meant. Not that Sandra agreed with Johnson's conclusion, but that Sandra was sitting with the specific anxiety of someone who loves a person and has been handed a version of events in which that love is the cause of harm. It was a cruel manipulation, and it was effective because it was aimed precisely at the place where Sandra was most likely to take it seriously, her capacity to care about someone else's well-being more than her own position. He went back to work. The morning's cases needed reviewing. The surgical team sent a positive update on the construction accident patient. The staffing coordinator needed a decision on 2 new hire approvals, and the East Wing HVAC, which had been fixed the previous week, had developed a secondary issue that maintenance was now describing as foundational rather than mechanical. He handled all of it. He sent Sandra a text at noon just to check in, nothing loaded, and she replied within a few minutes with a brief warmth that told him she hadn't yet made a decision. He did not press. He knew how to wait. Tuesday was quiet in the way that days before a weather event are quiet. He caught Sandra for lunch near the hospital, a 40-minute window between her morning vendor calls and an afternoon site inspection. She was composed and fully present, and she didn't mention the phone call. Neither did he. They talked about the literacy event, which was 3 weeks away, and the keynote speaker she'd confirmed, and a donor who had doubled his contribution after seeing the program outcomes data. "You look tired," she said. "Busy week." "Is there anything—" She stopped herself, restarted. "Is there anything going on at work that I should know about?" He looked at her across the table. She was giving him the opening. She had learned it was there, Angela probably, or her own intuition, and she was offering it to him directly rather than pressing. "There's a board review Thursday," he said. "Routine. I have the data prepared." It was not a lie. It was also not the whole truth. He watched her decide whether to accept it. "Okay," she said and went back to her salad. The set of her mouth told him the conversation wasn't finished, just postponed. Wednesday at 3:15, Daniel's phone rang from the school nurse's office. Lily had fallen on the playground after lunch. A hard fall, knee and shoulder, the kind that would have been unremarkable, except that her heart had registered the impact stress and produced an arrhythmic response, brief, self-resolving, but flagged by the nurse's pulse check as irregular enough to warrant a call. By the time Daniel arrived at the school 12 minutes later, Lily was sitting in the nurse's office eating a graham cracker and explaining to the nurse why the heart was actually very good at fixing its own minor problems if you gave it time. She said that. Daniel looked at the nurse. Word for word. The nurse had the expression of someone who had worked with children for 20 years and still occasionally found them surprising. Daniel took Lily's pulse himself, checked her eyes, made her track his finger. Everything had resolved as he had known it would. The defect was monitored annually. The arrhythmias were known to occur under physical stress and self-terminate. Clinically, this was a non-event. He had told himself this 11 times on the 12-minute drive over. The county hospital's pediatric cardiology unit would need a notification. He would review her chart tonight. The annual monitoring visit was already scheduled for January, 6 weeks out. He would call Dr. Reeves tomorrow and discuss whether to move it up. "Daddy." Lily reached over and put her hand on his arm with the particular gravity of a child who could tell that her parent needed settling. "I'm okay." "I know," he said. "Eat your cracker." He called the school's front office to arrange for her early pickup, then sat in the plastic chair beside her for the 10 minutes it took to process the paperwork. His pager went off twice. He silenced it both times. Sandra arrived at the hospital waiting area at 11 that night. He was at the nursing station reviewing Lily's monitoring chart. The pediatric ward had admitted her for the recommended 24-hour observation, which Daniel had approved with the specific conflict of a man who knew the protocol was correct and would have made the same call for any other child, and hated that he had to make it for this one. Lily had been asleep for 2 hours. She had made him promise to bring her rabbit in the morning. Sandra came through the ward doors in her work clothes, hair still up, coat over her arm. She had come directly from something. "Who called you?" Daniel looked up from the chart. "Lily did." Sandra set her bag down quietly so the sound didn't carry to the sleeping rooms. "Around 4, from the nurse's office before her phone got taken away. She had my number saved." A pause. "Under Lady." He hadn't known Lily had made the call. He had assumed Angela or Dorothy, someone adult and deliberate. The information required several seconds of reprocessing. "She said," Sandra continued, her voice careful and even, "Sandra, Daddy is going to act like everything is fine, and he needs someone to make sure he eats something." She reached into her bag and produced a deli container. "I stopped on the way." Daniel looked at the container, then at Sandra. Something in his chest did what it had been doing with increasing frequency around this woman, moved in a direction that he didn't have a clinical term for and had stopped trying to name. He took the container. He was in fact hungry. He had not eaten since noon. They sat in the small family waiting area off the ward, 2 chairs at a right angle, a table with a tissue box, and a plant that was doing its best. The ward was quiet around them. The nighttime hospital sounds were different from the daytime ones, lower, more deliberate, the particular rhythm of a building that was still working, but had changed its register. Sandra waited until he had eaten half the sandwich. Then, "Tell me what happened." He told her all of it: the school call, the nurse's assessment, the self-resolving arrhythmia, the 24-hour monitoring protocol, what the defect was and what it wasn't, the statistics on pediatric VSDs and their long-term prognosis, which were good. He told her the way he told families in the ER, complete, precise, with the clinical framing that gave people something to hold on to while the emotional processing caught up. When he finished, Sandra said, "What do you do with the part that isn't clinical?" He looked at her. "The part that's just, she searched for it. Her. What do you do with that part when you can't fix it?" He was quiet for long enough that it became its own answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "I put my hand on her chest and I count." Sandra reached over and took his hand. Not as a romantic gesture, as a specific, deliberate act of witness. She held it the way Dorothy had held his wrist at the reception, with the same particular intentionality, but without assessment. Just presence. They stayed in those chairs until 2 in the morning, when the night charge nurse came to check on the family waiting area and found them there and said nothing, only left a second box of tissues on the table. Thursday arrived without the courtesy of being preceded by a night of sleep. Daniel was at County General by 6, which gave him 90 minutes with Lily before he needed to be anywhere else. She ate the hospital breakfast with the diplomatic tolerance of a child who understood that some situations required accepting what was available. He read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through, the one about a girl who could talk to animals, and was trying to prevent a construction project from destroying a field where a family of foxes lived. Lily had opinions about every character. He let her have them. At 7:50, he walked her down to the pediatric playroom, which opened at 8, and which Lily had identified the previous night as containing a superior collection of art supplies. Dr. Reeves arrived at 8:15, reviewed the overnight data, confirmed that Lily's numbers had been entirely stable since admission, and cleared her for discharge by noon. Daniel authorized the discharge paperwork himself. He had learned not to do this for Lily's cases. There was a protocol about physicians treating family members, and he respected it in every room, except the one where the patient was his daughter, and the attending had already cleared her. He signed the forms and told the charge nurse he'd be back by 12. He was in the conference room at 1:58. Johnson was already there. 4 board members flanked her, 2 clinical, 2 administrative. Dr. Kenneth Lee from cardiology, who Daniel knew as a careful man with a precise mind. Dr. Margaret Flores from oncology. 2 administrators whose names he had and whose medical judgment he did not have occasion to evaluate. Johnson sat at the head of the table with the particular stillness of someone who had prepared for this and expected it to go a specific way. Daniel sat. He did not apologize for the morning. He did not explain Lily's hospitalization. He opened the outcomes file on his tablet and set it on the table where it could be seen. 75 protocol deviations, Johnson opened, in 7 months as director. That is by any reasonable measure an unusual pattern. 75 deviations with a documented patient survival rate of 97%, Daniel said. Complication rate of 2.8%, all minor, and resolved within standard care windows. Average length of stay 4.3 days below predicted baseline. He slid the tablet toward the center of the table. I'd ask you to identify which of those 75 deviations you believe represented poor judgment. Johnson did not reach for the tablet. The pattern itself is the concern. The pattern is the evidence. What I'm hearing is that you'd prefer a lower deviation rate with worse outcomes. I'd like that stated for the record. Lee leaned forward, reached for the tablet. He reviewed the first page with the focus of a man who had spent his career reading clinical data and knew immediately when he was looking at good numbers. Dr. Lopez, Johnson said, there are other matters this review is intended to address. Then let's address them. Your personal relationship with Sandra Anderson has created a perception of divided attention and potential conflict of interest. Daniel looked at Johnson directly, not with hostility, with the specific measured steadiness of someone who had decided exactly how this conversation was going to go and had no interest in being moved from that decision. My personal relationship has had zero effect on my clinical performance. The data in front of you confirms that. If you have a specific instance where you believe my professional judgment was compromised by my personal life, I'd like to review it. If you don't, then this review is not about my performance. Perception matters. Perception is not a clinical standard. He kept his voice even, level. The tone he used in trauma situations when someone in the room was about to panic and he needed to be the thing that didn't. Patient outcomes are a clinical standard. Staff retention is a measurable standard. Departmental efficiency is a measurable standard. If the board would like to review my performance on those metrics, I welcome it. But I won't concede that my private life is a legitimate subject for this board's authority, because it isn't. The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Lee was still reading. He turned to the second page. His expression was the careful neutrality of a man who had an opinion he wasn't ready to commit to publicly yet. "We'll take your data under advisement," Johnson said. "This review will continue." "How long is the continuation timeline?" Daniel asked. "That hasn't been determined." "Then I'd ask that you determine it now so that I can plan my department's operations accordingly." Johnson looked at him for a long moment. 3 weeks. Noted. He stood. "I'll provide any additional documentation you request within 24 hours of the request. My department is available for any performance audit you'd like to conduct." He picked up his tablet. "Thank you for your time." He was in the elevator before he became aware that his hands were not entirely steady. Not shaking, just the fine-grained tremor that happened when adrenaline finished its job and the body started accounting for what it had spent. He pressed the lobby button, breathed, let the elevator do its work. He picked up Lily at noon. She had made 3 drawings during her morning in the playroom, which she presented to him in order of importance. The third one was in purple. 3 figures as always. The third figure had something new, a smaller figure, very small, between the third person and Lily. Lily had not labeled it. When Daniel asked what it was, she considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved, and then said, "I don't know yet, but it felt like it should be there." He drove her home, made her lunch, sat with her while she ate and told him about the girl in the playroom who had a cast on her arm and had taught Lily 3 card tricks. He listened to all of it. He asked questions in the right places. He was entirely present, which was in the specific arithmetic of his life, the most expensive thing he knew how to give. His phone buzzed at 2:47. Sandra. He called her back when Lily went down for a rest. "Angela called me." Sandra's voice was level, deliberately so. "She told me about the review, all of it, not the version you gave me at lunch." He sat at the kitchen table. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it only did in November low, in amber, making the room look like something preserved. "I was going to tell you after Thursday. Thursday was today." "I know. Daniel." She stopped. He could hear her working through something, not anger, or not only anger, but the more complicated feeling of someone who had been trying to be allowed into the full picture and had been handed a portion instead. "Why do you do that? I didn't want you to." "I know what you didn't want. I'm asking why you think protecting me from information is the same as protecting me." He didn't answer immediately because the honest answer required assembling pieces he had been keeping in separate rooms. The habit of self-sufficiency, the 3 years of carrying everything alone, the specific fear not of being judged but of being a weight on someone who already had weight to carry. "I don't know how to let someone share the hard parts," he said finally. "I know that's the answer you deserve. I'm working on it." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "How did it go?" she asked. "The review." "I presented the data. Johnson is extending the review period 3 weeks. She has less board support than she expected." Lee was reading the outcomes file with the expression of a man who was going to have opinions later. "And the part about us, I told her my personal life was not within the board's authority, and I wasn't going to concede that it was." Another silence. Different quality from the last one. This one had something warmer in it, even across a phone line. "Lily called me yesterday," Sandra said, "from the nurse's office." "I know. She told me tonight. She said to bring you food because you wouldn't take care of yourself." "She's 6. "She's right." A pause. "I'm coming over tonight." "Not for you, for her. I told her I'd bring the purple markers she asked for." He looked at the amber light on the kitchen table. "Sandra, I know what you're going to say." "Do you? You're going to say you don't want this to become a burden I'm carrying because of something that isn't my problem. That's close. Here's what I'm going to say back." Her voice was steady in a way that he recognized the specific steadiness of someone who had thought this through before the conversation started. "You are not a situation I'm managing. You're not a problem I'm solving. If I'm choosing to be here, It's because I want to be here. And when you make decisions for me about what I can handle, you're not protecting me. You're just alone. And I'm tired of watching you be alone when I'm right here." He was quiet for long enough that the amber light shifted. "The purple markers," he said finally. "She's very specific about the shade. I know, she texted me a picture of the exact ones." He looked at his phone. There was a text from Lily's school tablet, a photograph of a marker set one specific shade circled in red crayon. "She has my number saved," he said. "Under Sandra now," Sandra said. "She updated it Tuesday." He did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Not because he was undone. He was not undone. Because something had quietly and completely shifted in the architecture of his life, the way load-bearing things shift, and he was only now becoming aware of how much had moved. "Come over," he said. "She'll want to show you the playroom drawings." Sandra came. She brought the markers the exact shade which Lily verified with the focus of a quality control inspector before declaring them acceptable. The three of them sat at the kitchen table while Lily drew and Sandra helped, and Daniel made dinner, and the ordinary weight of it, the sounds, the small negotiations, the particular warmth of a kitchen that had food in it and people in it settled around him like something he had forgotten was possible. After Lily went to bed, Sandra sat across from him at the table with tea she'd made herself in the mugs she'd started to know by position in his cabinet. "She drew something today," he said. "4 figures." Sandra looked up. The fourth one wasn't labeled. She said she didn't know what it was yet, but it felt like it should be there. Sandra held her mug in both hands. She didn't speak for a moment. "Johnson called me," she said then. "Last Wednesday. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." He nodded. "Let her have the shape of the telling. She said a man under investigation shouldn't have to make hard choices, and that someone who really cared about him would understand that." Sandra's voice was even, but the evenness was doing work. She said it like she was being kind, like it was advice. "I know. You knew before tonight. Angela told me Monday. I was waiting for you to bring it to me when you were ready." Sandra put down her mug, looked at him directly the way she did when she was done performing anything. "And if I'd decided she was right, then that would have been your decision to make." He held her gaze. "I wasn't going to argue you out of something you'd chosen. I would have let you go, even if you didn't want to. Especially then." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city kept its nighttime pace distant, unhurried, indifferent to the things being worked out in this particular kitchen. "I almost called her back," Sandra said. Wednesday night after she called. "I almost called her back and said, 'Yes, you're right. I'll step back,' and I had the phone in my hand, and I sat there for about 20 minutes. She looked at her tea. "And then I thought about Lily's drawing, the one with 3 figures. And I thought about what it means that a 6-year-old child who has lost the most important person a child can lose is sitting down and drawing the future she wants to live in." Her voice was very steady now, the bedrock kind. "And I thought, I'm not going to be the person who doesn't show up in that picture." Daniel didn't say anything. There were moments that needed witness, not response, and he had spent enough time in his life failing to understand the difference. She picked up her tea. He got up and made more hot water. They sat at the table until the hour got late enough that the city outside the window went quiet, and the house around them held its own particular silence. Not empty, not waiting, but inhabited in the way that mattered. When Sandra finally stood to go, she paused at the kitchen doorway. "Patricia Johnson," she said, "is going to find out what happens when she reaches into someone's life to move pieces that aren't hers to move." He looked at her. "I'm not asking your permission," she said. "I'm telling you so you're not surprised." He nodded once. She left. He sat at the table for another few minutes in the kitchen that still held the warmth of the evening, and he thought about a drawing with 4 figures and a small unlabeled shape between them, and a child who had said, "I don't know what it is yet, but it felt like it should be there." He thought Johnson should have picked a different man to pressure. He thought she had no idea what was coming. He locked the door, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on Lily. Her chest rose and fell. Her rabbit was under her arm. On the desk, the purple drawing waited in the dark. The suspension letter arrived on a Monday, which was the kind of timing that felt deliberate even when it wasn't. Daniel read it at his desk at 7:14 a.m. before his first case review, before his second coffee, before the day had accumulated enough weight to cushion anything. Effective the following Monday pending completion of the board's extended review, Dr. Daniel Lopez was relieved of his duties as Director of Emergency Medicine at County General Hospital. Administrative leave full pay access badge deactivated at close of business Friday. His deputy would assume interim directorship. Any outstanding authorizations requiring director-level approval should be submitted to the board office by Thursday. He read it twice, set it down, picked up his coffee. The coffee had gone cold while he was reading. He spent the rest of Monday doing the work. Every open authorization in his queue cleared. Every pending case review completed and documented. The surgical schedule conflict he'd been mediating between two department heads for 10 days resolved with a solution both parties could accept. The East Wing HVAC secondary issue, which maintenance had upgraded to critical authorized for full system replacement rather than continued repair. He wrote transition notes for his deputy thorough, enough to function as a manual. He did not complain. He did not explain. He worked with the intensity of someone who understood that the quality of the exit was part of the record. Friday, at close of business, he handed his badge to the security desk. Gerald, who had worked the desk for 11 years and knew Daniel by coffee order and arrival time, took the badge without ceremony and said, "See you soon, Dr. Lopez." It was the kindest thing anyone said to him that day. Sandra was at his apartment when he got home. She had a key. He had given it to her 3 weeks earlier in the way that significant things sometimes happen practically and without announcement, because the practical need had made itself obvious and everything else followed. She was in the kitchen making pasta. Lily was at the table doing homework with the focused seriousness she applied to everything academic, her rabbit propped against her backpack as an audience. "How was it?" Sandra turned from the stove. She had known about the letter since Tuesday. Angela had called her. Daniel had not been surprised. "Done," he said. He hung up his jacket, sat at the table across from Lily, who looked up from her worksheet and assessed him the way she always did, quick, complete, decisive. "Are you sad?" Lily asked. "A little." She considered this, returned to her worksheet. "Okay," she said. "Sandra made the good pasta. That helps." Sandra's back was to them both. Her shoulders moved in a way that might have been a laugh she was keeping to herself. Daniel watched her for a moment, the ease of her in his kitchen, the way she moved through it without hesitation, now knowing where things were, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since 7:14 that morning. "It helps," he agreed. The first week of suspension had a shape he hadn't anticipated. For 3 years, his days had been structured by the hospital, its rhythms, its demands, its gravity. He had built his life around its schedule so completely that he had stopped noticing the building. Now the building was gone, and he was standing in the open air of his own days, which was disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with the injustice of the situation and everything to do with the fact that he had forgotten what his days looked like without it. He took Lily to school every morning. This was not new. He had always taken her when his schedule allowed, which was less often than either of them would have chosen. What was new was the consistency. She began to rely on it with the trust of a child who has learned not to rely on things and is cautiously revising. She started telling him things in the car that she hadn't told him before. Not confessions, just the daily accumulation of a 6-year-old's interior life. Which teacher had been unfair at recess? What Zoe and her class had said about dogs. The card trick she was still trying to get, right, the one from the girl in the hospital playroom. He listened to all of it. He asked questions in the right places. He discovered that his daughter had opinions about everything and had been waiting for the space to have them. He picked her up every afternoon, made dinner most nights. Read to her, drew with her, sat at the table while she produced artwork of increasing ambition and explained each piece with the thoroughness of someone who expected her audience to keep up. He was present in a way that the hospital had always theoretically permitted and practically prevented, and the adjustment was not comfortable, it was better than comfortable, which was a different and more demanding thing. Dorothy called on the 4th day. "I want you to know," she said without preamble, "that I've already requested a meeting with the board." Daniel sat down. "Dorothy, not as Sandra's mother, as a retired cardiac nurse with 35 years of clinical experience and a genuine interest in outcome-based medicine." Her voice carried the warmth and precision he had come to recognize, the voice of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people were frightened and needed someone to be certain on their behalf. "I have your outcomes file. Angela sent it to me." Angela sent it to you. Angela is an excellent attorney who understands that the people with the most useful information aren't always the people with the loudest voice. A pause. She also told me you were going to say you didn't need help. I was going to say that yes. Daniel. Her voice shifted into the same register she had used at the reception, 3 words across a manicured lawn. You are very good at keeping people alive. You are not always good at letting people keep you alive. These are different skills, and they can coexist. He was quiet. The meeting is Thursday, she said. Board conference room A. I've been given 15 minutes. A pause that had satisfaction in it. I've prepared for 20. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, looking out the window at the November street, and thought about the first time she had taken his pulse, the intention of it, the information she had gathered in 3 seconds and used without explaining herself. He thought about how long she had been paying attention before anyone knew she was. Thursday came. Daniel was not in the building. He was at Dr. Reeves' office with Lily for the rescheduled cardiology monitoring appointment, moved up from January at his request after the playground incident. He sat beside the examination table while Reeves reviewed the imaging, and he did not look at his phone, and he did not think about conference room A, and he focused entirely on his daughter who was telling Dr. Reeves about the card trick with the seriousness of someone who wanted a complete audience and intended to have one. Reeves reviewed the imaging with the unhurried thoroughness of a pediatric cardiologist who had learned that parents needed to see the process, not just the conclusion. He turned to Daniel with the expression of a man delivering something already decided. The residual gap has continued to close, Reeves said. At this rate, by her next annual, I expect we'll be reclassifying this as resolved. He looked at Lily. Your heart is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Lily nodded as if she had expected nothing less. I know, she said. I've been talking to it. Reeves looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Reeves. Neither of them spoke for a moment. That is, Reeves managed, an excellent approach. In the car on the way home, Lily was quiet for 2 traffic lights, which was unusual. Then Daddy. Yeah. Is Sandra going to stay? He watched the road. What do you mean stay like? Lily worked through the vocabulary carefully. Like not just come over. Like our house. Is that something you want? She thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. I think so, she said. She knows where everything is now, and she makes the right kind of tea. The right kind. Not too hot, so you can drink it right away. Lily watched the buildings go by. Mom's tea was always too hot. You had to wait a long time. A pause. Sandra's is right. He drove. The city moved around them in its afternoon rhythm. The light was doing the November thing low and amber, making everything look like something worth keeping. I'll talk to Sandra, he said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the buildings. His phone was full of messages when he got home and got Lily settled. Angela First Dorothy's meeting had run 22 minutes. Lee had asked Dorothy to stay for questions. The questions went for 40 minutes after her prepared remarks. Johnson had been present and had not spoken for the last 30 of them. Sandra next a text that said only, "Call me when you can," he called. Your daughter, Sandra said, sent the board a letter. The silence that followed had several components. What kind of letter? And he said, the handwritten kind, 6 years old purple crayon on lined paper from her school notebook. Sandra's voice had something in it she was working to hold level. Angela brought it in. Dorothy read it to the board before she presented the outcomes data. He sat down on the couch. What did it say? Sandra read it to him. She had a photograph. The handwriting was Lily's, large, uneven, thoroughly determined. It said, my daddy saves people every day. He saved me. He saves everybody at the hospital. I know because I asked him. Please let him go back. He is really good at it, and also he is my dad. Lily Lopez, age 6. He sat on the couch and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Daniel, Sandra said. I'm here. Lee read it twice, she said. The room was quiet for about 10 seconds after Dorothy finished. Johnson didn't say anything. He pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. His pulse was elevated. He was aware of this in the way he was aware of his own breathing. Clinical noted, set aside. She didn't tell me she was doing it, he said. No, she told Angela. Angela told Dorothy. Dorothy said yes before Angela finished the sentence. A pause. I think the three of them have been coordinating for about a week. He thought about this. About Dorothy on the phone that morning, prepared and unhurried. About Angela, who had known the outcomes file was a tool and had put it in the right hands without waiting to be asked. About his 6-year-old daughter, who had a phone number saved under a name that had changed twice now, and who had apparently decided that the situation called for direct communication with the county hospital board of directors. I have no control over any of this, he said. It was not a complaint. It was a recognition, and underneath it was something that felt cautiously like relief. No, Sandra said, and he could hear that she was smiling. You really don't. The board met Friday morning. Daniel knew about it 40 minutes after it concluded, when Angela called from the parking lot with the energy of someone who had been professionally contained for several hours and was now in a location where she could stop. 7-2, she said. Lee moved to reinstate. Flores seconded. Johnson voted no. Everyone else voted yes. A breath. Reinstatement effective Monday. Full directorship, no conditions, no probationary period. Daniel was at the kitchen table. Lily was at school. The apartment was quiet around him. The outcomes data, he said. The outcomes data was important. Dorothy was important. The letter, Angela stopped. Daniel, when Dorothy read that letter, Lee put his pen down. He didn't pick it up again until after the vote. A pause. You should tell Lily. I will. And Daniel. Her voice went to the register reserved for the things that mattered most between them, the one she had been using since they were children in their mother's house. You're allowed to feel this one. You don't have to move directly to the next task. He sat at the kitchen table after she hung up. The November light came through the window at its low amber angle, the same light that had been there the night Sandra had said, I'm not leaving, and he had opened the door. He thought about the letter in purple crayon, the gravity of a 6-year-old's conviction that her father was worth advocating for. The quiet work of 3 women who had, without his direction, assembled the argument he hadn't been able to make for himself, not because he lacked the capability, but because some arguments can only be made by people who love you and are not afraid to say so in front of strangers. The sound he made was not crying. It was the thing that lives next door to it. He let it be what it was for approximately 90 seconds. Then he got up, washed his face, and started making lunch. Sandra called at 2:47. He answered before the second ring. You're back, she said. Monday. How do you feel? He considered the question honestly. Like I owe a 6-year-old a significant apology for underestimating her. Sandra laughed, the real one, unguarded from somewhere that didn't require permission. She's going to hold it over you. I want you to know that going in. She should. He picked Lily up at 3. She ran to the car with the momentum of a child who had been waiting for this moment since morning. She climbed in, buckled herself, turned to look at him with her full attention. Did it work? She said. Did what work? She looked at him with the patience of someone who had very little of it to spare for deflection. My letter. He looked at his daughter. 6 years old, with her mother's cheekbones and her own gravity, and a heart that was closing itself one careful year at a time. It worked, he said. I go back Monday. Lily nodded, satisfied, and turned to look out the window. I knew it would, she said. I used the good paper. He drove for half a block before he trusted his voice again. Gary Young called that evening. Daniel answered on the 4th ring. Gary's voice was direct, without preamble. I want you to know that I spoke with Patricia Johnson on Wednesday. Not on your behalf, I want to be clear about that. I went as a private citizen who has spent 30 years watching how institutions behave when they're wrong and know it. A pause. I told her that when a system punishes the right man to protect the wrong policy, the people running that system know exactly what they're doing, and they spend the rest of their careers knowing it. What did she say, or nothing? That was informative. Gary was quiet for a moment. Then, I also want you to know that Brian Thompson reached out to Sandra earlier this week. He called to tell her that he'd been carrying Thomas's grief like it was a weapon and that he'd aimed it at the wrong person. He said he needed to say it to her before he said it to you. Another pause. I thought you should know what changed in him before he finds you. Daniel filed this. It reordered the shape of Thompson's apology from unexpected to earned. All right, he said. My daughter, Gary said, and the register shifted, not softer exactly, but deeper. Carrying weight he didn't usually let show, has rebuilt herself 3 times in her life. Her career, her confidence, her willingness to try again after Thomas. I have watched her do it, and I have not always understood what it cost her, because she doesn't let people see the cost. A pause. She lets you see it. Daniel said nothing. He understood this was not the place for a response. That's not a small thing, Gary said. In my experience, it's everything. He let a beat pass. You go back Monday. Yes, sir. Good. The word had the finality of a man closing a file on something that had been open too long. That's where you should be. The literacy nonprofit event fell on a Saturday in mid-November, 2 weeks after reinstatement, which Sandra had confirmed in a single text the morning of today, is going to be good. Daniel had read it at 6 a.m. while Lily was still asleep and had understood it as both a statement and a commitment. Sandra had been building the event for 3 months. 200 guest silent auction dinner, keynote address on childhood reading outcomes. He had watched her coordinate it the way he watched good surgeons work everything. Deliberate, nothing wasted the result made to look easier than it was. The keynote speaker canceled at 8:47 p.m. the Friday before. Food poisoning. Urgent care in Columbus. Daniel was in Lily's room finishing the fox book the girl had saved the foxes. The construction company had rerouted. The field was intact when his phone lit up with Sandra's name. He handed the book to Lily with an instruction to hold the ending and stepped into the hallway. The keynote canceled. Sandra's voice was level in the way it got when she was managing something complicated and keeping the management invisible. I need someone to fill 15 minutes. Health literacy patient outcomes. Someone credible who can make 200 people feel it instead of just hear it. He was already doing the calculation. The talk he had been carrying for 4 years, not an academic one, the real one. 3 studies he knew without notes. 1 story he had been waiting for the right room to tell, about a woman who couldn't read her discharge instructions and came back to the ER 3 days later with a preventable complication, and whom he had sat with for an hour because she was ashamed, and he needed her to understand the shame belonged to the system. Send me the timeline, he said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Daniel, I'm leaving in 2 minutes. Send the timeline. He handed Lily to Angela, who was on the couch with her own book, and accepted the reassignment with the equanimity of someone who had been conscripted into situations like this for 35 years. Lily looked at him over Angela's shoulder. Are you going to give a speech? Yes. Are you going to be nervous? No. She considered this. Okay, she said. Do a good job. He made it in 17 minutes. Sandra met him at the stage entrance, still in motion, the clipboard that was effectively a third hand. She saw him coming through the door and stopped. Just for a moment, the way motion stops when something expected and hoped for arrives at the same time. You came, she said. You asked. She crossed to him and kissed him with the intention of someone who had something to say and was saying it this way. Not briefly, not for anyone watching. Then she stepped back, straightened his lapel, and handed him the revised timeline. You're on at 7:45, she said. 15 minutes. They've had cocktails and dinner, so don't make it academic. I know how to read a room. I know you do. She was already turning back toward the event floor. Make them feel it. He took the stage at 7:47. 200 people post-dinner, the attentiveness of an audience that had been warmed up by good wine and a cause they already believed in. He spoke for 16 minutes without notes. He talked about the gap between health information and health understanding, not as a policy problem, but as a human one. The loneliness of sitting in an exam room and not being able to decode the document that was supposed to get you well. He cited 3 studies briefly without jargon. He told the story of the woman with the discharge instructions. He did not make it sentimental. He made it true, which was harder, and landed further. And when he finished, the room held its breath for 4 full seconds before it responded. That kind of silence meant something had actually arrived. Sandra found him afterward at the back of the room where the cleanup crew was beginning to work the edges of the crowd. 17 minutes, she said. I went long. It was perfect. She took his hand. Come on. There are people you need to meet. She introduced him to the nonprofit board, to 3 major donors, to a city councilwoman who had been funding childhood literacy programs for a decade, and who shook Daniel's hand with the grip of someone recognizing a useful ally. Every introduction followed the same form. This is Daniel Lopez. He's the director of emergency medicine at County General. He's my partner, not boyfriend. Partner. He noted it the first time and understood what she was doing, presenting him as a person with his own standing who happened to also be standing with her. It was a small distinction, and it was not small at all. Brian Thompson found him near the bar at 9:15. Daniel had been tracking him since Thompson arrived 20 minutes earlier, without an invitation on the guest list. He watched Thompson navigate through the thinning crowd with the direction of a man who had made a decision and was not looking for permission to follow through on it. Thompson stopped in front of Daniel. His expression was not the one from the estate settlement, the hard, defended face of a man with somewhere to put his anger. This was what was left after that. Older, less armored. I said things I can't take back, Thompson said, keeping his voice low, not from discretion, but from the weight of saying something he actually meant. At the estate settlement, and before that, I was carrying Thomas's death like it was something I could aim at people, and I aimed it at you because you were there, and you were an easier target than the fact that he was gone. He met Daniel's eyes. I called Sandra earlier this week. I needed to say it to her before I said it to you. I owed her that order. Daniel waited. Thomas had a way of reading people fast, Thompson said. He used to say you can tell everything about a man by how he behaves when it costs him something. Not when it's easy. When it costs, he extended his hand. I watched what happened with your hospital. I heard what your daughter did. I know what it cost you, and I know you didn't flinch. A pause. He would have liked you. I think I'm going to like you too if you'll let me get there. Daniel shook his hand. He did not say it was fine because it hadn't been. He did not offer absolution because that wasn't his to give. He held the handshake for a beat, with the same steady grip he used for everything, not aggressive, not forgiving, just present, and then released it. Gary Young was standing 6 feet away. Daniel had not noticed him arrive. Gary watched the handshake with the expression of a man seeing something he had been waiting to see confirmed, and then he turned and went to find Dorothy, and Daniel understood that some verdicts don't require announcement. Angela appeared at his elbow as the event fully wound down. She had brought Lily. Lily had argued her way into coming for the last hour, and Angela had agreed for reasons she described as strategic, and which Daniel suspected were more affectionate than strategic. Lily stood beside Angela in her good sweater, holding her rabbit, surveying the theater, with the gravity of someone who had been told this was an important place tonight and was taking that seriously. Did you do good? Lily asked. I think so. Sandra said you were excellent. Lily delivered this as settled fact. She said it to 3 different people. I counted. Sandra came from the direction of the stage, thanking a volunteer stacking chairs. She saw Lily, and her face did what it always did when Lily appeared, opened immediately without reservation. Lily crossed the room and held up her arms. Sandra crouched and held her, and Lily said something into her shoulder that Daniel couldn't hear, and Sandra laughed, the real laugh, the one that didn't ask permission. Angela leaned close to Daniel. She's good for you. I know. And you're good for her. She bumped his shoulder with hers, the gesture she'd been making since they were children in their mother's kitchen. Mom would have liked her. Yeah, he said. She would have. Lily walked back to him and took his hand. Can we go home now? She asked. Sandra, too. That's up to Sandra. Sandra had heard. She was already reaching for her coat. Sandra, too, she said. They went home, all 3 of them, in Daniel's car, Lily between them in the back seat, in the arrangement she had recently established as non-negotiable. Narrating the late-night city with the running commentary of a child who found everything worth describing and assumed her audience agreed. Sandra listened and responded, and occasionally looked across Lily's head at Daniel in the way of someone who was not performing being here, but simply was here fully and without reservation. At the apartment, Lily went through the bedtime routine with the efficiency of a child who had a goal on the other side of it. Daniel read the last chapter of the fox book. The girl had saved the foxes. The field was intact. While Lily leaned against Sandra on the couch, the rabbit in her lap, eyes tracking the words. She was asleep before the final page. Daniel carried her to bed. Sandra stood in the doorway while he settled Lily in, put the rabbit under her arm, turned on the nightlight. On the desk in the blue glow, the drawings were arranged in the sequence Lily had chosen, oldest to newest, moving, left to right, like a timeline she was building in real time. The first ones, 2 figures plus mom. The middle ones, 3 figures, the third labeled with a name that had changed from Lady to Sandra. The most recent ones, four figures, the unlabeled small shape, still waiting between Sandra and Lily, patient and unhurried. They went to the kitchen. Daniel made tea. Sandra sat at the table without being told to, in the chair she had made her own over the last 2 months, and the quiet that settled around them was the inhabited kind, full rather than empty, the silence of people who have stopped needing to fill it. Reeves, Sandra said after a while. He said her heart is closing. At the rate it's going, he thinks it'll be resolved by her next annual. Sandra held her mug. She told me last week she's been talking to it. She told Reeves the same thing in the exam room. What did he say? He said it was an excellent approach. Sandra looked at her tea. I think she's right, she said. I think some things close better when you stay with them. She looked up at him across the table. I love you? She had said it before at the theater entrance, quick and certain in the middle of logistics. This was different. Deliberate, unhurried, the kind of statement that wasn't looking for a response so much as establishing a fact that deserved to be said in a quiet room. Say it again, he said. She held his gaze without flinching. I love you, Daniel Lopez. I needed to hear it when nothing else was happening, he said. Just this. Just the room. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her tea was the right temperature, drinkable immediately, no waiting. He had noticed this about her from early on, without fully understanding why it registered. Now he thought he understood. She paid attention to the things that were supposed to be small. She knew the difference between comfort that arrived when you needed it and comfort that arrived when it was convenient. They sat at the table until late, talking about nothing large, the event, Lily's new drawing ambitions, a restaurant Sandra had been meaning to try, the Fox books ending, and whether the sequel would hold up. The easy accumulation of two people who had decided to build something together and were doing it the only way it actually gets built. One ordinary evening at a time, without shortcuts, without guarantees. With the specific courage of people who have already lost things and decided to try again anyway. At some point, Sandra said, my lease is up in February. He looked at her. I spend more nights here than there, she said. Lily knows where the purple markers are. You know my coffee order, and I know yours, and we've stopped explaining ourselves at 4 a.m. She held his gaze without hedging. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm telling you where I am. I know where I am too, he said. Tell me. I want you here, not visiting. Here. He turned his hand over under hers and held it properly. Lily asked me in the car today if you were going to stay. She said you make the right temperature tea. Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed quietly so it didn't wake Lily. The laugh that was entirely unguarded, the one he had first seen on a Sunday morning over a bowl of pancake batter that was too thin and needed fixing. February, she said. February, he agreed. She stayed that night. In the morning, Lily came to the kitchen at 6:30 and found them both there. Daniel with coffee, Sandra with tea, and accepted this with the calm of someone whose expectations had been met. She sat at the table, asked for the colored pencils, and began working on something with focused deliberateness. She drew for a long time. When she was done, she set it in the middle of the table and went to get her backpack without comment, as if the drawing could speak for itself. 4 figures. The small, unlabeled shape between Sandra and Lily had a label now. Lily had written it in careful block letters in purple, pressed down hard so the color was solid and certain. The label said ours. Daniel looked at the drawing. Sandra looked at the drawing. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the November morning was doing what November mornings do, gray and cool and indifferent to the things being decided inside kitchens across the city. But inside this one, on a table between two people who had both learned the hard way that love is not the absence of loss, but the decision to stay present inside it. A 6-year-old's drawing said the only word that mattered. Lily came back with her backpack, looked at both of them, and said, "You have to take me to school now." Daniel stood up. Sandra stood up. They took her to school. There are people in this world who stay, not because it's easy, it rarely is, not because they're certain, they almost never are, but because they understand somewhere past the point where logic lives that presence is the whole thing. That showing up when it costs you something is the only version of love that means what it says. Daniel Lopez had spent 3 years understanding the difference between being necessary and being alive, between keeping people breathing and breathing himself. He had learned it the way such lessons tend to land, not in a single moment, but across 100 small ones in pager calls at 4 in the morning, and crayon drawings left on kitchen tables, and the warmth of tea made at exactly the right temperature by someone who had decided he was worth paying attention to. Grief doesn't negotiate. It doesn't shrink because you found something new to love, and it doesn't ask permission to stay in the room. What changes is not the grief, but the room itself. It gets larger, and the new things and the old things learn to share the space, and eventually the room feels like home again, rather than just the place where loss lives. The bravest thing Lily Lopez ever did was not the letter to the board. It was the first drawing, the one she made before anyone asked her to, before anything was certain, where she looked at the future she wanted and put it on paper. That's the thing about children. They haven't learned yet to protect themselves from hope. They just draw what they see. If someone in your life has ever stayed when leaving, would have been easier, tell them. Not someday. Tell them the way Lily told the board, plainly in your own handwriting, with conviction that the truth is enough on its own. And if you've ever been the person who stayed, you already know why. Tell us in the comments who in your life has shown up when it cost them something. And if you've never told them what that meant to you, maybe today is the day.